In today's world, there's a growing amount of fake and biased news that is rapidly spreading through social media. AI and automation have made this something that can now be weaponized. It is now more important than ever to be able to sift through this information to get to the truth. While there is no way to perfect this, I'm going to outline what I think is the best way to do this. Before I do that though, I want to really specify the problem and extent of fake news and why it very easily could get worse going forward. MIT Sloan professor Sinan Aral did an in-depth study of this phenomenon and came to some very interesting conclusions. First, they found that false news spreads much faster than real news. This is a scary thought, and one might come to some generalizations as to the causes. One might assume that the bots found in YouTube comments, Twitter feeds, and everywhere else are the main cause of false news spreading faster. The researchers removed bots from the equation when they did their study and found that false news still spreads faster. So if it is not the bots, then one might assume that the Twitter posters spreading false news have a lot more followers. Instead, they usually had less followers than the more reputable sources. They also followed fewer people and were less active. So the hypothesis that these researchers came to is that human nature is the cause of false news spreading faster. They call this the novelty hypothesis, meaning that people have a tendency to be attracted to things they view to be new. False news is often provocative and certainly new in many cases, so people have a tendency to retweet and share false information more so than true information. To reach this conclusion, they analyzed the responses to the false news postings and found that there was a high amount of words landing in the novel categories such as surprise, fear, and disgust. These words were much less common in the posts that were not false. So human psychology is again to blame for this phenomenon. Essentially what is happening is bad actors, whether they be foreign governments or just some random shock jocks trying to get popular and make money through grifting, are using this human psychology nefariously. They just have to release this information into the wild, and the character flaws of the human race do the rest. The problem is this is likely to get worse as new technologies such as AI and generative adversarial networks can now be leveraged to make extremely convincing news almost indistinguishable from real news stories. Essentially what many people call deepfakes are made using these technologies, and they are scary good already in terms of realism and will only get stronger over time. So the question then becomes, how do we combat this? Is there a way for us to verify the information we are taking in? Well, like I said, there is no perfect way to do this, but I have what I think is a decent approach. I am open to debate on other approaches, as I think we have yet to truly see any super high quality resources developed yet to help combat these false news stories. Also, I'm trying to improve myself and realize that my approach could very well be flawed as well, because after all, I'm also a flawed human. So let me know in the comments what you think about the approach I'm about to outline and what ways it could be improved. The first and I think best way we can combat this is to narrow our field of news sources to only those that have minimal bias and a strong record of accurate reporting. I hear many people say that their approach is to simply get the perspective of both sides and make a decision from there. The problem I have with that approach is the times that both sides are actually both wrong on an issue versus just going to a reliable resource that is right most of the time. This 2014 blog post from PolitiFact highlights the amount of times that Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN were just straight up wrong. Fox News was wrong 58% of the time, MSNBC 45%, and CNN 22%. I suspect those numbers are probably much higher by now, and in particular I have a feeling CNN has a much higher percentage of false claims versus 2014, but even at 22%, that is a staggeringly high number and completely inexcusable for a gigantic corporate network that employs teams of people that could easily fact check their stories and should realistically be reporting correct news 95% of the time or more. It is completely inexcusable for these networks to be wrong this often. I also feel it is inexcusable for the American public to continue to support them by watching these sources. The really scary thing about this data point is that people are starting to watch alternative media sources more often. And I think in many cases, these sources that have gained a lot of popularity are even more extremely partisan and wrong more often. That being said, there are some news sources that I truly believe are very unbiased in their reporting and have a long track record of being unbiased. How can we find and vet these sources? Well, there's a fantastic chart from Ad Fontes Group that has already done the research and vetted these sources. What I like about this is that it rates these news sources for both bias and reliability. The methodology they use to rate news sources is to go article by article, and a panel of 3 raters, one of them left-leaning, one with a right lean, and one that is centrist, are selected from a pool of raters. This team of 3 each rate the article, and they combine the scoring, and then that score is used as a score for the bias and reliability of that individual article. Then they do this for a number of articles on the website, and the average is taken to produce the overall bias and reliability score for that news source. This is a pretty robust method, in my opinion, and the interactive chart they produce with this data is absolutely fantastic as well. I really like this resource and recommend using it. There's another resource from All Sides Media. This only rates for bias, and when you read the methodology of how they came to these scores, I actually think they use a more robust methodology. Whereas AdFontest is just 3 random raters, All Sides uses the same sort of multi-partisan editorial rating system combined with blind bias surveys, community feedback, and some other methods, which you can read about on their ratings methods page. The blind bias survey is where articles are sent out without any identifying information to a pool of people from all political spectrums, and ratings are then collected and tabulated into a final score. Consideration is given to the bias of the person that is rating it. Finally, All Sides also considers community feedback, as ratings can be voted on once they are released. Overall, I think All Sides has a more robust approach, but I think both are pretty comprehensive in the way they are rating these sources. That being said, another problem with these rating sites is they use humans to go through and analyze this material, and that takes time. If you look at the AdFontest page for PBS, for instance, the most recent URL is from January 7th, 2021, and prior to that, October 22. It could be that they have consistently found PBS to be reliable and non-biased, so they do not have to update the scores very often. Other sites like CNN seem to get a lot more ratings. It is my view that if people stuck to sources that are relatively neutral from either All Sides or AdFontest, preferably both, then the spread of misinformation would stop. But that is not likely to happen anytime soon, unfortunately. My personal favorite news source is the PBS NewsHour daily broadcast in the evenings. Both AdFontest and All Sides rate the sources center, with the AdFontest showing them having a very small left lean, but they are very high on the reliability scale. These sources are both really solid for showing what kind of bias exists on networks as a whole, but what about bias and accuracy of individual news stories? Well, for that, there are a ton of sources out there. Some of the more popular ones are Snopes, PolitiFact, FactCheck, and Media Bias FactCheck. There are problems with all of these sources, the biggest being that there have been academic studies that were done which show some real political bias shows up in these ratings. I will get into that and the other issues with these sites later in the video, but for now I want to mention the positives and the one I really like the best. The main positive of these sites is studies have shown that they actually do work to reduce the amount of false beliefs people have. Now for the one I like the most, that is Media Bias FactCheck. What this website does is it takes the ratings for Snopes, PolitiFact, FactCheck, and all their fact checkers that are a member of the International Fact Checking Network, and basically double checks the fact check to determine if it is indeed a correct fact check. This second layer of fact checking is something I really like, as it increases the odds that the fact check is accurate. That is not to say it is 100% accurate, because that is impossible, but it does help. Media Bias FactCheck also has a browser extension that will show you the rating for the website you're on. It does not show the individual articles rating. There's a paid extension called NewsGuard that does that. But the Media Bias FactCheck extension is a nice little tool to have, and it is free as well. Now that we have talked about the good of the fact checkers, let's talk about the bad. First, around half of people just don't think they are neutral. And there is some evidence of that with some studies that have been done that show some real bias does creep in. One of the popular fact-checking groups, PolitiFact, was shown to rate Republican statements as dishonest 3 times more often than Democrat statements. While it is possible Republicans lie more often, 3 times as often is probably an overshoot. Another issue is inconsistency between fact-checking groups. A study from Chloe Lim found that the fact-checkers tended to agree on the things that were rated very truthful or very untruthful, where there is a pretty wide range of outcomes was in the gray areas, partially true or partially untrue areas. Another story found a correlation between fact-checker scores of 0.67, a positive correlation but not a high positive correlation, which brings up some questions as to whether something can even be partially untrue. Also, some things simply can't be proven to be true or false. There just isn't enough data to do that, but often the fact-checkers try anyways. Bias is also a factor in the inconsistency of ratings. Another issue the fact-checkers run into is that some of these organizations only report on false claims, which leads to a bias towards false claims. Doing the research only to find something is not false ends up being a waste of time, so they have a tendency to push things into the false pile when they really should not be. Another interesting study found that taking 1,100 laypersons and having them do a blind bias review of news articles actually came to a very similar, if not even more accurate bias rating than the professional fact checkers. This approach might be better than having professional organizations do the fact checking. There's a lot of literature that points to the wisdom of crowds, and across many fields, taking random views from the public and averaging them comes to the correct answer. If fact checking was done in this manner, bias could be basically eliminated from the equation, as there would be a large cross-section of views. It is logistically challenging to do such a thing, but potentially could be a solution. It will be hard to convince the establishment professional fact checkers to do this though, obviously. That is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. Like and subscribe, and don't forget to let me know your favorite ways to check facts in the comments. Thanks.